CEO Li Jinwu was a man of ice, his life an eternal winter. His son, little Hajun, lived in melancholic silence, a smile unseen for months. But one day, returning to retrieve his forgotten phone, Li Jinwu stopped, shocked. His eyes could barely believe what they saw, the humble cleaner Kim Min-ji with his son in her lap, taking a selfie on his own phone. And the most unbelievable part, Hajun was radiant, kissing her cheek, a joy the CEO hadn't witnessed in months. What was this woman doing? And how had she achieved what no one else could? The air in the living room, once static and heavy, now seemed to vibrate with an energy Li Jinwu didn't recognize. It was shock, a shock so profound it froze every muscle in his body, every beat of his heart. There she was, Kim Min-ji, the cleaner who moved like a silent shadow through the corridors of his mansion, holding his son, Hajun, in an embrace that felt strangely natural. And the smile, oh, that smile on Hajun's face, an explosion of pure, uninhibited joy the CEO hadn't seen in months, perhaps years. His son, the little prince of ice who barely responded to his own efforts, who retreated into a world of silence and melancholy, was now radiant. His small arms wrapped around the cleaner's neck, and his childish lips kissed her cheek with a tenderness that tore at Jinwu's chest. The flash of his own phone, in her hands, captured the moment. A selfie, a forbidden, intimate, stolen image. Jinwu's mind, sharp as a steel blade, struggled to process the scene. Anger. Yes, a cold wave of fury began to form. How dare she? How dare she touch his son with such familiarity? How dare she use his phone to record such a personal moment? The invasion of privacy was blatant, the audacity unforgivable. But beneath the anger, something more disturbing bubbled. Envy, a bitter, corrosive envy. He, the great Li Jinwu, CEO of an empire, father to Hajun, had failed miserably to bring this joy to his son. All the trained nannies, the child psychologists, the expensive toys, the luxurious trips. Nothing had worked. And now a simple woman, a cleaner, with a seemingly trivial gesture, had achieved the impossible. She had broken the ice barrier surrounding Hajun's heart. His eyes, accustomed to scanning financial reports and complex contracts, now fixated on the details. The way Min-ji held Hajun, with a lightness and security that suggested practice, not just a passing moment. The way she laughed, a soft, genuine sound Jinwu had never noticed before, and which now seemed to echo in the room, contrasting with the house's usual silence. Hajun, in turn, seemed mesmerized by her, his eyes shining with a light Jinwu had forgotten existed. The CEO felt a tightening in his chest. It was the pain of realizing his own powerlessness. He, who controlled everything in his professional life, was a stranger to his own son. And this woman, this intruder, seemed to hold the key to Hajun's secret world. Min-ji, oblivious to the icy presence observing her from the doorway, leaned her head towards Hajun, who was still laughing, and murmured something. The boy responded with an enthusiastic nod, and she took another selfie, this time with Hajun making a funny face, and her laughing openly. Jinwu's heart froze even further. It wasn't an isolated incident. It wasn't a mistake. It seemed a ritual. He needed to act. He needed to confront her. But the image of Hajun, so happy, so alive, paralyzed him. If he reprimanded her now, the joy on his son's face would vanish, the smile would fade, and silence would return. He couldn't bear that. Not yet. One step, a single misstep, and the spell would be broken. The tension was palpable, cutting the air like an invisible knife. Jinwu clenched his fists, nails digging into his palm. He watched for another moment, absorbing every detail of that scene which challenged him, humiliated him, but which, paradoxically, also fascinated him. Mind, He forced his voice out, an icy whisper that, despite its low volume, carried the weight of his authority and his contained fury. Kim Min-ji. The name sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. The cleaner froze, the smile instantly vanishing from her face. Her eyes, previously full of warmth and amusement, widened in panic as she slowly turned to meet Lee Jin-woo's piercing gaze. The phone, still in her hands, now seemed like incriminating evidence. Ha-jun, sensing the abrupt shift in atmosphere, pressed himself against her, the joy on his face transforming into confusion and then into a familiar fear. CEO Lee Jin-woo had returned, and with him, Winter. The sound of Kim Min-ji's name, uttered in that icy voice, reverberated through the room, not as an echo, but as a shard of ice shattering the fragile moment of joy. Min-ji's smile vanished, the color drained from her face, and her eyes, once filled with a maternal light, widened in pure terror. The phone, which seconds before had recorded Ha-jun's happiness, now felt like a heavy, incriminating object in her trembling hands. She turned slowly, as if every fiber of her being resisted the inevitable confrontation, and met Lee Jin-woo's gaze. It was a gaze that promised nothing but condemnation, an abyss of contained fury and disillusionment. Ha-jun, the little ray of sunshine that had lit up the room, felt the abrupt change. The joy on his childish face was replaced by painful confusion and then by a familiar fear that made him shrink against Min-ji. His small arms clutched her neck with desperate strength, as if she were his only safe harbor amidst the brewing storm. The silence that followed was deafening, filled only by the accelerated beat of Min-ji's heart and Jin-woo's heavy breathing. Winter had returned, and this time it seemed harsher than ever. Lee Jin-woo took a step forward, and then another, each movement calculated, each sound of his shoes on the marble echoing like a verdict. His eyes, which had previously absorbed the scene with a complex mixture of anger and envy, now fixated on Min-ji with an intensity that made her want to disappear. He didn't need to shout. His presence, his aura of power and disapproval, was more than enough to crush her. "What do you think you're doing, Kim Min-ji?" Jin-woo's voice was low, but sharp as an ice blade. There was no room for negotiation, for excuses. It was an accusation. "With my son, with my phone, inside my house." Each word was a blow, and the cleaner felt herself shrink, unable to formulate a coherent response. Shame and panic suffocated her. Ha-jun, sensing the tension, began to whimper softly, his face hidden in Min-ji's shoulder. He didn't understand the words, but he felt his father's anger, the sadness emanating from him, and the fear of the woman holding him. The sound of his son's crying, however, did not soften the CEO. On the contrary, it only fueled his fury. How dare she disturb his son's peace, even if it was a melancholic peace? How dare she be the cause of his fear? I'm so sorry, CEO Lee," Min-ji finally managed to stammer, her voice barely a whisper. Her eyes welled up, and she tried to gently push Ha-jun away, but he clung to her even tighter. He was so sad. I just wanted to make him smile." She pointed to the phone in her hands, still displaying the forbidden selfie. "He picked up the phone, CEO. He wanted to see the pictures. And he laughed. I swear, he laughed." The mention of Ha-jun's smile, that laughter he had witnessed but which now seemed so distant, struck Jin-woo like lightning. The anger that drove him began to mix with the memory of that ephemeral joy. He wanted to believe her, wanted it to be true, that his son could smile, but the invasion of privacy, the audacity of an employee, was unforgivable. "You are an employee, Kim Min-ji," Jin-woo continued, ignoring the plea in her eyes. "Your job is to clean. It is not to entertain my son. It is not to use my belongings, much less to take pictures." He moved even closer, and Minji recoiled a step, clutching Hajun against her. The boy was sobbing now, and the sound broke Minji's heart, but seemed only to harden Jinwoo's. "I know, CEO Lee. I know it was wrong," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But he wouldn't stop crying. And he asked me to hold him. He asked me to play. I didn't think straight. I just wanted to see that smile again." She looked at Hajun, who now gazed at her with tear-filled eyes, and then at Jinwoo, a mixture of despair and strange determination in her look. "He hasn't smiled like that in a long time, CEO Lee. Don't you see?" That last sentence, uttered with a courage she didn't know she possessed, hit Jinwoo squarely. "Don't you see?" The question echoed in his mind, a cruel reminder of his own failure. He saw, he had seen, and that was precisely what consumed him. Envy, humiliation. He, the father, couldn't, and she, the cleaner, could. "That does not give you the right to invade my privacy, to use my phone, to take advantage of a child's innocence," Jinwoo retorted, his voice rising a pitch, his control beginning to falter. "You are fired, Kim Minji. Gather your belongings and leave this house immediately." The words fell upon Minji like a death sentence. Fired. She, who so desperately needed that job, who had found a small refuge in Hajun's joy. But before she could react, before she could plead again, Hajun, who until then had only been crying, lifted his head. His small, red, swollen eyes fixed on his father. He extended a trembling little hand towards Jinwoo, not with anger, but with a silent plea. And then he stammered a word, a single word that broke the ice in Jinwoo's heart and froze the air in the room. Oma. The word mom in Korean sounded like thunder. It wasn't for Minji, it was for Jinwoo. Little Hajun, in his desperation, had confused the comforting figure with the mother he barely knew, the mother who had left him. CEO Lee Jinwoo, the man of ice, felt his world collapse. The anger, the fury, the envy. Everything transformed into a searing pain. His son, his own son, had called her mom, and not for him. He looked at Minji, who was equally shocked, and then at Hajun, who now gazed at his father with an expression of pure confusion and sadness. What had this woman done? And what would he do now? The winter in his heart threatened to become an uncontrollable storm. The word Oma hung in the air, a ghost in the deafening silence of the room. It wasn't a sound, but an echo of loss. A cry of desperation that tore through the veil of control Lee Jinwoo had built around himself. His eyes, previously fixed on Minji with icy fury, now widened. The world, which he thought he controlled with an iron fist, collapsed in an instant. His son, his own son, calling a stranger mom. And it wasn't for her, he knew. It was for the maternal figure Hajun barely knew, the shadow of a woman who had left him. It was a lament, a plea, a silent accusation directed at him. The father who was miserably failing to fill that void. A chill ran down Jinwoo's spine, colder than any winter his heart had ever endured. The anger, which had previously burned like hellfire, transformed into a searing pain, a sharp pang that made him stumble internally. He had fired Minji, but now the sentence seemed empty, insignificant compared to the magnitude of that single sound. Hajun, with his red, swollen eyes, still looked at him, at his father, with childish confusion, as if asking why the world was collapsing again. Minji, in turn, was paralyzed. The phone slipped from her trembling hands, falling onto the soft carpet without a sound. Her eyes, wide with horror, darted between Hajun and Jinwoo. She knew what that word meant, the weight it carried. It was a mistake, an accident, a manifestation of a child's pain, but in the current circumstances, it was a condemnation. She felt Hajun's small body tremble in her arms, the crying that had subsided now restarting, more desperate. Jinwoo took a step back, as if he had been physically struck. His mind, always so logical and calculating, was in chaos. He had lost control, completely. The image of Hajun kissing Minji's cheek, the genuine joy on his son's face, the smile he had witnessed, all now mixed with the word Oma, forming a whirlwind of contradictory emotions. Envy, guilt, anger, despair. He was the father, the CEO, the man who should protect and provide, but it was this woman, this cleaner, whom his son sought for comfort. It was she who made him smile. It was she who, for an instant, filled the mother's void. What? What have you done? Jinwoo's voice was a hoarse whisper, almost unrecognizable. It was no longer the voice of a furious CEO, but that of a broken man. He was no longer accusing Minji of invading his privacy or misusing his belongings. He was accusing her of something far greater, something that touched the deepest wound of his soul, of having become, even for a brief and painful moment, the maternal figure his son so longed for. Minji, finding a courage she didn't know she possessed, hugged Hajun tightly. "I didn't do anything, CEO Lee, I swear. He was just crying. He missed his mother. He just wanted some affection." Tears streamed freely down her face now, not just from fear, but from a profound sadness for the child in her arms and for the evident pain on the father's face. "He didn't call me Oma. He was calling his mother. He just saw me and confused me." Minji's explanation, though logical, did not calm Jinwoo. On the contrary, it only intensified the pain. Hajun's confusion was a mirror of his own failure. His son was so desperate for a mother that he projected that image onto anyone who offered him a glimmer of warmth. And this was the woman he had just fired, the only person who in months had managed to elicit a genuine smile from Hajun, the only one who, for a brief instant, had made his son feel safe enough to express his deepest pain. "Confused," Jinwoo repeated, the word laden with bitter irony. "Do you think that makes the situation better, Kim Minji? My son is so desperate for a mother that he confuses you with her. You took advantage of his vulnerability. You inserted yourself into a place that doesn't belong to you." His voice rose again, but this time, the anger was mixed with palpable anguish. He no longer knew if he was angry at her, at himself, or at the cruel fate that had left him in this situation. Hajun, sensing the intensification of his father's voice, buried his face in Minji's neck, sobbing uncontrollably. The small body trembled, and Minji rocked him gently, her own tears wetting the boy's hair. She looked at Jinwoo, not with defiance, but with a silent plea. "He needs someone, CEO Lee," she said, her voice choked. "He needs affection. He needs attention. He needs a mother. And you. You're not here for him." The words escaped before she could stop them, a brutal truth she knew she had no right to utter. But Hajun's pain was so real, so palpable, that she could no longer restrain herself. The accusation, direct and blunt, struck Jinwoo like lightning. He wasn't there for him. The phrase echoed in his mind, a verdict he couldn't dispute. He was always at the office, always in meetings, always fleeing from the pain, from the responsibility of being the sole parent. He had hidden behind his fortune, his work, his grief, and his son was paying the price. Jinwoo looked at the cleaner, at the woman he had just fired, who now confronted him with the most painful truth of his life. She wasn't afraid of him, not at that moment. She was afraid for the child in her arms. And that courage, that passion, that humanity was something he hadn't seen in himself for a long time. The winter in his heart threatened to become an uncontrollable storm, but there was a small crack, a fissure in the ice layer, an excruciating doubt. He had ordered her to leave, but how could he let her go when his son, in his desperation, had called her Oma? How could he ignore the fact that she, and only she, had brought a glimpse of joy and comfort to little Hajun? What would he do now? The decision was in his hands, and its weight was unbearable. Those words, "You're not here for him," weren't just an accusation. They were a mirror, reflecting the ugliest truth Lee Jin-woo refused to see. He, the ruthless CEO, the man who built an empire with his own hands, was miserably failing at the only thing that truly mattered, being a father, the work, the fortune, the grief that consumed him since his wife's departure. Everything was an escape. An escape from pain, yes, but also an escape from the overwhelming responsibility of filling the void she had left. Ha-jun, his son, was living proof of his absence, a constant reminder of his inability to be the father the child deserved. His fists clenched, nails digging into his palm, a physical pain that barely compared to the searing pain in his chest. He wanted to scream, to vehemently deny, to expel that insolent woman from his house, from his life, from his mind. But Ha-jun's muffled sobs, the small body trembling and clinging to Min-ji, were a silent testimony that disarmed any defense, any argument. It was a tremor that he, the father, should be calming, but which was now being comforted by a stranger. The air in the room seemed to have solidified, heavy, with the undeniable truth. Jin-woo looked at Ha-jun, who still hid his face in Min-ji's neck, and then at the cleaner, whose tear-filled eyes still met his gaze with a mixture of fear and an almost reckless courage. She wasn't afraid of his anger anymore. She was afraid for the child, and that was the crucial difference between them. He was consumed by anger and pain. She was moved by compassion. The image of Ha-jun's smile in the selfie, the kiss on Min-ji's cheek, the word Oma echoing in his mind like a death knell. Everything fit into a painful picture. He had isolated himself in his grief, in his work, in his ivory tower while his son languished in silence, and now this woman, this simple cleaner, had invaded his world, not with malice, but with the purest form of humanity, exposing his deepest flaws. He couldn't fire her, not now, not when Ha-jun called her Oma, even by mistake, not when he clung to her like a lifeline in a sea of loneliness. The humiliation was immense, a blow to his pride he never imagined he'd endure. But his son's need, the sight of that genuine joy, even if fleeting, was greater. He needed Min-ji, at least for now, at least until he could figure out how to be the father Ha-jun deserved, the father he had failed to be. A heavy sigh escaped his lips, laden with the bitter resignation of a man cornered. He took a step forward, then another, closing the distance between them. Min-ji instinctively recoiled, pressing Ha-jun even tighter against her, as if expecting an attack. But Jin-woo was no longer furious. He was exhausted, broken. "You are not fired," he said, his voice hoarse and low, almost a whisper. The words seemed to cost him monumental effort, as if each syllable was torn from his soul. Min-ji blinked, surprised, her eyes wide. Ha-jun, sensing the change in his father's tone, lifted his head slightly, his sobs diminishing to sniffles. "But, Jin-woo continued, raising a hand to interrupt any protest or question from Min-ji. "But things will change. You will no longer be the cleaner of this house." Min-ji looked at him, confused, the tension still palpable in her shoulders. She expected a reprimand, a new threat, perhaps even the police, but not this. You will be Ha-jun's nanny," he declared, his voice gaining a tone of cold authority, trying to regain the control he felt he had lost. "Full-time, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Your sole responsibility will be to care for him, make him smile, make him happy, as you did today." The proposal dropped on Min-ji like a bomb. Nanny? Full-time? That job, which she so desperately needed, now transformed into something much more intimate, much more demanding, and infinitely more dangerous. She, the cleaner, the stranger, the woman he had just accused of taking advantage of his son, would now be Ha-jun's primary caregiver. "CEO Lee, I don't know if..." Minji began, her voice trembling, but Jinwoo cut her off again. There are no ifs, Kim Minji. It's either this or you leave, now, and I guarantee you will never find employment in Seoul again. The choice is yours. His voice was icy again, the CEO resurfacing, but there was an underlying urgency, a veiled plea she couldn't ignore. He was giving her an option, yes, but it was an option that tied her to him, to Hajun, and to all the complexity of that house. She looked at Hajun, who now gazed at her with his large, sad eyes, a small tear still tracing his cheek. The boy, sensing her hesitation, pressed into her arms, a small sound of desperation escaping his lips. He needed her. Jinwoo, in his coldness, had recognized this. I accept, she said, her voice barely audible but firm. But with one condition. Jinwoo raised an eyebrow, surprised by her audacity. Condition? I won't just be a nanny, CEO Lee, Minji continued, finding a new wave of courage. I will be someone who cares for Hajun. And you will have to be present. You will have to try to be the father he needs. I can't do this alone. Minji's audacity hit Jinwoo like an electric shock. She wasn't just accepting, she was imposing terms. She was challenging him again. But this time, it wasn't about privacy or rules. It was about his son's soul. The winter in his heart hadn't completely melted, but that crack, that fissure, had widened. He looked at Hajun, who now gazed at him with an expression of cautious hope. And then at Minji, the woman who had just become his most unlikely ally and his most honest critic. The storm in his heart still raged, but a new and complex dynamic had been forged. The battle for Hajun's soul had only just begun, and now he would have to fight alongside the woman he had tried to fire. Jinwoo didn't respond immediately. His silence was heavy, laden with contained fury and reluctant acceptance. He couldn't deny the truth in her words. He couldn't ignore his son's desperation. With an almost imperceptible movement of his head, a cold, distant nod, he sealed the agreement. It wasn't consent, but a tactical surrender. He was accepting the terms, not because he agreed with her audacity, but because Hajun's need was greater than his wounded pride. Minji felt a shiver run down her spine. That nod was a wordless contract, a dangerous promise. She had the job, but at what cost? She had tied herself to a cold man and a grief-laden home with the responsibility of healing a boy, and perhaps even his father. Hajun, feeling the tension ease, let out a small sigh. He was still clinging to Minji, but his sobs had ceased. His eyes, previously filled with panic, now showed a glimmer of relief. It was as if the world had stopped collapsing around him. Minji gently rocked him, a protective warmth radiating from her. "It's okay, little one," she whispered, kissing the top of his head. "It's okay now." Jinwoo watched the scene, a sharp pang of envy and shame piercing his chest. That touch, that tenderness, that ability to calm his son. These were things he had forgotten how to offer, or perhaps had never learned to give. He was a CEO, not a father, and the difference was stark. He turned abruptly, his back rigid, and walked towards his office door. "Take him to his room," he ordered, his voice still hoarse, but with a tone of finality, "and prepare dinner, for him and for you." The last part was said almost as an afterthought, a forced concession. He wasn't used to having anyone else in the house besides the employees who came and went. Minji nodded, her heart still pounding. She knew the real battle began now. She was no longer a shadow cleaning corners, but a presence, a voice, a force in Hajun's life, and that meant she would be under Jinwoo's microscope every second. With Hajun still nestled in her arms, she climbed the stairs. The weight of responsibility almost overwhelming. The boy seemed lighter now, his body relaxed against hers. In Hajun's room, she gently placed him on the bed, sitting beside him. He looked at her with his large, curious eyes, a small hand reaching out to touch his face. "Oma," he whispered again, the word a thread of hope. Minji felt a knot in her throat. "No, Hajun," she said softly, forcing a smile. "I'm Minji, your new friend." She couldn't allow herself to be Oma. She couldn't fill a void that wasn't hers to fill. But the pain in the boy's eyes was so deep that she knew she needed to be more than a friend. She needed to be a safe harbor. Meanwhile, Jinwoo was in his office, the door closed, but the sound of his heavy breathing echoed in the silence. He tried to focus on the reports on his desk, on the profit and loss charts, but Minji's words and Hajun's face overlaid every number, every strategy. "You're not here for him." The accusation was a constant echo, a silent torture. He stood up and went to the window, looking at the lit city. He had built an empire, but his own home was in ruins. He had fired people without batting an eye, but now he was tied to a woman he barely knew because of his son. The irony was cruel. He heard the faint sound of a melody coming from upstairs. Minji was singing, a soft lullaby, a melody he hadn't heard since his wife had left, a melody that he, in his grief, had forgotten how to sing. A cold anger ignited within him. How dare she bring such intimacy, such warmth into his grieving home? How dare she make his son smile when he couldn't? But beneath the anger, there was an insidious curiosity, a small, almost imperceptible flicker of hope. He had failed. He knew it. And perhaps, just perhaps, this insolent woman, with her courage and her compassion, could do what he couldn't. The night advanced, and Minji came down to prepare dinner. She found the kitchen immaculate, but cold, lifeless. She prepared a simple tofu stew and rice, something Hajun could easily eat. When she called him, the boy came down the stairs, his eyes still a little red, but with a new calm. Jinwoo didn't appear. He was in his office, immersed in his work, or perhaps in his own misery. Minji felt frustration grow. She had imposed a condition, and he was already failing. "Your father is busy." "Hajun," she said, trying to keep her voice gentle, but the bitterness was palpable. Hajun merely nodded, accustomed to his father's absence. But Minji was not willing to accept that. She had accepted a job, but also a mission, and that mission included CEO Lee. After Hajun ate and was ready for bed, Minji took him back to his room. She helped him get dressed in his pajamas and tucked him into bed. "Good night, Hajun," she said, kissing his forehead. "Good night, Minji Oma," he murmured, already falling asleep. The words struck her again, a bittersweet reminder of her new and complex role. She stood up, but before leaving, looked at the small, sleeping face. He needed more than just her. He needed his father. With renewed determination, Minji walked to Jinwoo's office door. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding. She was about to cross a line no employee would ever dare. But she was no longer just an employee. She was the guardian of Hajun's hope. She knocked on the door, a firm, decisive rap. The silence from the other side was broken by a cold, impatient, "Enter!" Minji opened the door and stepped in, finding Jinwoo seated at his enormous ebony desk, the lamplight illuminating his severe face. He didn't lift his eyes from the documents before him. "Ha-Jun is sleeping," she said, her voice calm, but with an underlying strength. "He ate well, but he asked for you." Jinwoo finally lifted his eyes, his expression a mask of irritation. "I am busy. Kim Minji, you don't need to report every detail to me." "It's not a detail, CEO Lee," she retorted, her voice gaining firmness. "It's your son, and your condition for me to stay was your presence, CEO Lee. Presence of body and soul, not just a signature on a check." The air in the room grew dense, charged with Minji's audacity. Jinwoo stared at her, his eyes dark as night. A silent fury bubbling beneath the surface. He was accustomed to being obeyed, not reprimanded. But her words, once again, struck a painful truth. The battle for Ha-Jun's soul had only just begun, and Min-ji was willing to fight for it, even if it meant challenging Seoul's coldest CEO. And Jin-woo, to his own horror, realized that deep down, he wanted her to fight. He wanted her to force him to be the man he had forgotten how to be. The air in Jin-woo's office grew so dense, it seemed to suffocate. Min-ji's audacity was a direct challenge, an affront to his unquestionable authority. He stared at her, his eyes dark as night, a silent fury bubbling beneath the surface. No one, absolutely no one, had ever spoken to him that way, much less an employee. Anger was a familiar shield, an automatic response to any threat to his control. "You are overstepping your bounds, Kim Min-ji," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word sharp as a blade. "I am CEO Lee. I don't need moral lessons from you." But Min-ji didn't back down. Her eyes, though a little apprehensive, remained firm. She wasn't there to please him, but to fight for Ha-Jun. "And I am Min-ji," she replied, her voice calm but with unwavering determination. "And I am here for your son, and your son needs a father, not an absent CEO. Your condition for me to stay was your presence, CEO Lee. Presence of body and soul, not just a signature on a check." Her words struck Jin-woo like a physical blow, piercing his shield of anger and hitting a deep wound. He wanted to refute, wanted to fire her right there, but the image of Ha-Jun crying in her arms, the word Oma whispered with desperation, stopped him. He was CEO Lee, the man who built empires, but before the raw, naked truth of his failure as a father, he was just a lost man. He averted his gaze, unable to sustain her challenge. The fury was still there, but now mixed with corrosive shame. He couldn't deny. He couldn't run. With an almost imperceptible sigh, he leaned back in his chair, his posture still rigid, but the tension in his shoulders a little more visible. "Leave," he ordered, his voice hoarse, devoid of previous fury, only a deep weariness. "I need to think." Min-ji felt a faint relief, but also a new wave of responsibility. She had won a small battle, but the war was far from over. She bowed slightly and left the office, leaving Jin-woo alone with his demons. The house was silent, but for Min-ji the silence was a blank canvas, ready to be filled with life. She went downstairs, her heart still pounding, but with a new energy. She was no longer merely a cleaner. She was a force, a presence, and she would begin to heal that home, one step at a time. The next morning, Min-ji woke early, even before the sun. She prepared a simple but nutritious breakfast and brought it to Ha-Jun. The boy, seeing her, offered a small smile, a ray of sunshine amidst the melancholy that hung over the house. They ate breakfast together, Min-ji telling small stories and making funny faces that made Ha-Jun laugh, a sound Jin-woo hadn't heard in months. While Ha-Jun played in the living room with some dusty toys Min-ji had found in a cupboard, she began to clean the house with a new perspective. It wasn't just about removing dirt, but about removing the weight, the sadness that clung to every corner. She opened the curtains, letting the sunlight in, aired out the rooms, and even put on soft music, something to bring a little lightness. Jin-woo, for his part, remained in his office, immersed in his work, or at least trying to be. Min-ji's words echoed in his mind, a constant torture. He heard the sounds of the house, Ha-Jun's laughter, the soft melody, the faint noise of cleaning, and each sound was a reminder of what he wasn't doing, of what he had lost. He felt like a stranger in his own home, an observer from afar. At noon, Min-ji prepared lunch for Ha-Jun and brought it to the kitchen table. "Your father is in his office, little one," she said, trying not to let her frustration show. "But he'll come down for dinner, I'm sure." She knew she was promising something she couldn't guarantee, but the hope in Ha-Jun's eyes was something she couldn't crush. Days turned into a routine. Minji became Hajun's anchor. She woke him, fed him, played with him, read to him, and put him to sleep. She was the light in his darkness, the voice that calmed him. And slowly the house began to change. Small drawings by Hajun appeared on the refrigerator. A vase of fresh flowers emerged on the dining room table, and the smell of home-cooked food replaced the sterile silence. Jinwoo observed everything from afar, a ghost in his own home. He saw Hajun laughing, smiling, something he hadn't seen in so long. He saw the house coming to life, and each time he saw Minji with his son, a pang of envy and deep shame struck him. He was the father, but it was she who was building the bridge back to Hajun's joy. One afternoon, Jinwoo had gone out for an important meeting, forgetting his phone on his desk. He needed it for a crucial document. He returned home earlier than expected, his mind still on the complexities of work. Upon entering, the house was strangely silent, but not with the cold silence from before. There was a soft melody coming from upstairs, a lullaby Minji often sang. He climbed the stairs, his steps echoing on the marble. Hajun's bedroom door was ajar. He stopped, an insidious curiosity pulling him. He heard Minji's soft voice, and then Hajun's joyful laughter. He approached, peeking through the crack. What he saw paralyzed him. Minji was sitting on the floor, Hajun in her lap, both laughing. She held a phone, Jinwoo's phone, and was taking a selfie. Hajun, with his bright eyes and a radiant smile, was kissing Minji's cheek, a kiss of pure affection. The image was one of intimacy and happiness Jinwoo hadn't seen in his son for months, perhaps since before his wife's death. The scene was an electric shock, a direct blow to his frozen heart. Anger bubbled, hot and instantaneous. How dare she touch his phone? How dare she take pictures with his son in his house? But beneath the anger, there was something deeper, something that terrified him. It was the sight of Hajun's genuine joy, a joy that he, the father, couldn't provide. It was irrefutable proof that Minji had succeeded where he had miserably failed. He watched for another moment, unable to move. Hajun pulled back from the kiss, looking at the phone screen, his face lit up. "Again, Oma Minji," he exclaimed, and Minji laughed, a warm, melodious sound. The word Oma hit Jinwoo with the force of lightning. His son, his little Hajun, calling that woman Oma. Jealousy, pain, and shame mixed in a whirlwind. He felt the ground give way beneath his feet. The cleaner, the woman he had tried to fire, was stealing his son's heart, and somehow was doing it in a way he couldn't completely hate. The image of the kiss, the smile, Hajun's happiness imprinted itself on his mind. Painful proof of his own absence and Minji's overwhelming presence. The cold CEO was back to retrieve his phone, but what he found was a truth that dismantled his world. Lee Jinwoo's world, built on steel pillars and ruthless logic, crumbled in a single devastating instant. The frozen image before him was a tableau of pure happiness, one he didn't recognize, but which struck him with the force of a tsunami. Hajun, his son, the heir to his empire, was there, in the arms of Kim Minji, the cleaner he had hired out of desperation, and who had now become the usurper of his child's heart. The kiss on the cheek, Hajun's radiant smile, the light in Minji's eyes as she held his phone, capturing that intimate moment, all of it was an affront, a betrayal of his very existence as a father. But it was the word that echoed in his mind, repeating like a hammer striking his skull. Oma Minji, Oma, mother. That sound, laden with brutal innocence, pierced the armor Jinwoo had built around his heart. It wasn't just anger nor jealousy, it was a primary ancestral pain, the feeling of being replaced, of being erased. The image of his deceased wife, Hajun's true mother, flickered in his mind, a silent ghost that seemed to watch him with sadness. How had he allowed this? How had he failed so miserably that his own son sought solace and worse motherhood in the arms of a stranger? His body stiffened, frozen in the doorway. Every muscle tense, every breath shallow. He wanted to explode, to scream, to snatch the phone from her hands and smash it against the wall. He wanted to fire her, to expel her from his house and his life forever. But he couldn't move. The scene was so vivid, so full of a joy he couldn't replicate, that it paralyzed him. Ha-Jun's laughter, that melodious sound he had barely heard for months, now filled the air, a cruel reminder of his own emotional absence. He watched Ha-Jun nestle even deeper into Min-ji, his small arms wrapping around her with a familiarity that cut Jin-Woo like 1,000 knives. That was his son, his only son, and he was giving his heart, his affection to another woman. The woman he had treated with disdain, whom he had tried to humiliate, whom he had underestimated at every turn. Anger bubbled, but it was an impotent anger, mixed with corrosive shame. He couldn't deny the truth unfolding before his eyes. Ha-Jun was happy, genuinely happy, and that happiness, he knew with terrifying certainty, didn't come from him. It came from her, his eyes, dark and stormy, fixed on the phone in her hands. His phone, the object that had brought him back home, the catalyst for this devastating revelation. She was using his property to create memories with his son, memories that completely excluded him. The audacity, the insolence, and almost imperceptible tremor ran through his body. He clenched his fists, nails digging into his palm. Fury was a heat rising in his throat, but fear was a cold spreading through his veins. The fear of losing Ha-Jun forever, of being relegated to a distant, unimportant figure in his own son's life. The fear that Min-ji, with her simplicity and kindness, had achieved what he, with all his money and power, never could. Ha-Jun's unconditional love. He took a step back, then another, the sound of his own footsteps muffled by the whirlwind in his mind. The cold marble beneath his feet seemed to give way. He couldn't confront her now, not like this. His voice would fail, his anger would consume him, and he didn't want her to see the extent of his vulnerability, the crack in his facade as an unshakable CEO. He turned, moving away from the ajar door, from Ha-Jun's laughter, from the word Oma. Each step was heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He went downstairs, not to retrieve his phone, but to escape the scene that had stripped him bare. In his office, he collapsed into his chair, his body heavy, exhausted. The darkness of the room seemed to welcome his own inner darkness. The image of the selfie, the kiss, the word Oma spun in his mind, a cruel carousel of accusations. He was a failed father, an absent husband, even after his wife's death, unable to fill the void she had left in his son. He closed his eyes, trying to push away the images, but they persisted. Ha-Jun's joy, his genuine, undeniable joy. That's what he wanted for his son, wasn't it? But why did it hurt so much to see it coming from someone else? Why did it hurt so much to know he wasn't the source of that happiness? The truth that dismantled his world, was that Kim Min-ji wasn't just a cleaner. She was the bridge to Ha-Jun's happiness, the light that he, Jin-Woo, had failed to be. And, to his own horror, he realized that despite all his anger and jealousy, there was a part of him that was grateful. Grateful that someone had managed to pull Ha-Jun from the darkness, even if that someone wasn't him. But this gratitude was a poison, mixed with the bitterness of his own inadequacy. He had returned to retrieve a phone, but found a truth that would force him to confront not only Min-ji, but himself. The battle for Ha-Jun's soul had become a battle for Lee Jin-Woo's soul, and he knew with icy certainty that he was losing. The tension in the house hadn't diminished. It had transformed, becoming an invisible electrical current, ready to explode at any moment. The following days were a silent torture for Jin-Woo. He hadn't retrieved his phone that day, leaving it behind as a relic of his humiliation. The important meeting had been compromised, and the professional consequences were an additional burden, but insignificant compared to the weight on his heart. He found himself avoiding Minji, his eyes darting away whenever she entered his field of vision. But at the same time, he couldn't stop watching her. His steps were quieter, his movements more furtive. He spied on her from his office door, from the top of the stairs, through the crack in the kitchen door. He saw her preparing Hajun's meals with a tenderness he had never shown, reading stories to him in a soft, patient voice, teaching him to draw with genuine enthusiasm. Every laugh from Hajun, every spontaneous hug the boy gave Minji, was a stab in Jinwoo's chest. He saw the house continue to flourish under her touch. Hajun's drawings on the refrigerator multiplied, fresh flowers were regularly changed, and the smell of freshly baked cookies occasionally wafted through the house, an aroma of home he hadn't smelled in years. He was the CEO of an empire, capable of moving mountains in the business world, but there, in his own home, he was an impotent spectator, a stranger in his own son's life. The word Oma continued to haunt him. He heard it in his dreams, in his thoughts, a constant reminder of his failure. He tried to rationalize. She was just an employee, a temporary substitute. But the intimacy he had witnessed, Hajun's pure, uninhibited joy, belied any cold logic. It was real. It was profound. And it was something he, with all his money and power, couldn't buy nor force. One afternoon he saw her in the garden with Hajun. They were planting small seeds in a flower bed. Minji, with dirt-stained hands, laughed as Hajun tried to imitate her movements, his face covered in soil and a smile from ear to ear. She helped him with infinite patience, explaining about the life that would sprout from those seeds. Jinwoo, hidden behind a curtain, felt a pang of something that wasn't anger, nor jealousy, but a deeper pain, the pain of loss. He had lost those moments. He had lost the chance to be that father. Anger, once a consuming fire, began to transform into bitter frustration mixed with a hint of despair. He couldn't fire her. Not now. Not after seeing what she had done for Hajun. But he also couldn't tolerate the sight of her stealing his son's heart. He needed to do something. He needed to reclaim his place. But how? How could he compete with the simplicity and genuine love Minji offered? He, the businessman, the strategist, had no tools for this battle. The tension in the house was palpable, though only for Jinwoo. Minji continued her work with the same dedication and care, seemingly oblivious to the whirlwind forming in her employer's mind. She had noticed Jinwoo's strange quietness, the way he seemed to avoid her, but attributed it to his reserved nature and work stress. She had no idea that her simple act of taking a selfie had triggered an existential crisis in the cold, calculating CEO. Jinwoo knew he couldn't continue like this. The truth he had discovered was a slow poison corroding his soul. He needed to confront Minji, confront himself, and somehow redefine his role in Hajun's life. But each time he thought of his words, they died in his throat. What would he say? Stop making my son happy. Stop being a mother to him? The words were absurd. A testament to his own failure. The battle for Hajun's soul had become a battle for Lee Jinwoo's soul, and he knew with icy certainty that he was losing, but that he needed to fight. The next move, he realized, would have to be his, and it would be the most difficult of his life. The opportunity arose that very night. Hajun was already asleep, and the house was immersed in the heavy silence Jinwoo knew so well. He found her in the kitchen, finishing up the last dishes, the faint countertop light illuminating her profile. She looked tired, yet there was a serenity in her movements. He felt his heart quicken, a mix of nervousness and strange anticipation. This wasn't a business meeting. There was no script, no projections, only the raw truth of his emotions. "Minji shi," he began, his voice sounding hoarser than expected. She turned, her eyes wide with surprise. It was rare for him to address her directly, especially at night. "Yes, President Lee," she replied, her voice low and respectful. He noticed the way she clasped her hands, a small sign of nervousness he hadn't noticed before. He hesitated, the words dying in his throat. What would he say? How would he begin to unravel the tangle of jealousy, pain, and admiration he felt? He took a deep breath, trying to invoke the same calculating coldness he used in board meetings, but it didn't work. I need to talk to you," he said, the formality breaking slightly. He approached, stopping at a respectful distance. "About Ha-Jun." Minji's body stiffened. He saw the fear in her eyes, the instant understanding that something was wrong. She probably thought he would fire her. Guilt struck him, but he needed to continue. I've been watching," he confessed, the words coming out with difficulty. "The way you care for him, the way he is with you." He paused, searching for the right words. He's never been so happy. Not since his mother left. Minji lowered her gaze, her face pale. I just try my best, President Lee. He's such a sweet boy." "I know," Jinwoo replied, his voice laden with an emotion he could no longer contain. That's why it's so difficult." He took his phone from his pocket, the same phone that had triggered everything. "I saw the pictures, the selfie." He handed it to her, the screen lit, showing Ha-Jun's radiant smile. "And I heard when he called you. Oma?" Minji's eyes widened again, this time with a mixture of shock and shame. "President Lee, I'm so sorry. I never meant to. I swear I didn't encourage him. It was a moment. He was so happy, and I didn't think. I know it was a serious mistake. I understand if you want to fire me." Her confession, so sincere and full of guilt, disarmed Jinwoo. He had expected anger, or perhaps a defense, not this vulnerability. "No," he said, his voice softer now. "It's not that. It's not about firing you." He took the phone back, the image of his son smiling at Minji burning in his retina. "It's about... what do you have that I don't?" He looked at her, the most painful question he had ever asked. How do you manage to make him smile like that? How do you make him feel loved? Minji raised her eyes to him, and Jinwoo saw not just fear, but a deep sadness. "President Lee," she began, her voice almost a whisper, "it's not that I have something you don't. It's that you are suffering. And Ha-Jun, he feels that. He feels your pain. I try to be the light for him when he's in the dark. I try to be the joy he needs." She paused, gathering courage. "You are his father. No one can replace that. But you need to be present. Not just physically, but with your heart." Her words struck him like a blow. The truth was undeniable, brutal in its simplicity. He had closed himself off, and Ha-Jun had felt it. He had pulled away, and Minji had filled the void. He, the cold and calculating CEO, was being unmasked by a cleaner, and for the first time in a long time, he felt no anger, only a searing pain of regret. I don't know how," he admitted, his voice choked. It was the first time he had confessed a weakness to anyone in years. "I don't know how to be that father again. I've lost my way." Minji watched him, the tension easing slightly, replaced by what seemed to be compassion. "You don't need to be that father again," she said softly. "You just need to be his father, your father, and perhaps you can learn, with him, with me." Her last sentence hung in the air, an unexpected offer of help, of partnership instead of rivalry. Jinwoo looked at her, the woman he had seen as a threat, now appearing as a bridge. The confrontation hadn't been one of anger, but of a painful truth. And that truth, he realized, was the first step towards his own redemption. The phone in his hand seemed less an object of accusation and more a mirror, reflecting not only Hajun's happiness, but his own failure and perhaps his only chance to start anew. Minji's offer hung in the air, a gentle breeze amidst the storm that was Jinwoo's mind. You can learn, with him, with me. Those words, so simple, so direct, were an invitation to a territory he, CEO Lee Jinwoo, had never explored. The vulnerability of learning from someone he employed. He, who gave orders, was now invited to be a student. It was a blow to his pride, but also an unexpected lifeline. He watched her, the faint kitchen light highlighting the sincerity in her eyes. There was no mockery, no superiority, just quiet compassion. What would he do? Would he reject the help and continue to sink into his own darkness, or would he swallow his pride and try? The image of Hajun, laughing in Minji's arms, flashed in his mind. That laughter was worth any sacrifice. How? The word came out almost inaudible, a confession of ignorance he never imagined uttering. How do I do it? Minji hesitated, as if measuring her words, aware of the weight of that moment. Start small, President Lee, with presence, with your gaze, with listening. She made a gentle gesture with her hands. Hajun needs to feel that you are truly there, not just in body, but in spirit. That night, Jinwoo couldn't sleep. Minji's words echoed in his mind, mixed with images of his son. He was a man of plans, of strategies, but how to plan affection, how to strategize love. He felt like a general without a map, without troops on an unknown battlefield. The next day, the house felt different. The tension hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed into a silent expectation. Jinwoo, instead of locking himself in his office, remained in the living room, pretending to read documents, but in reality, observing, watching Minji interact with Hajun. She didn't act like a teacher, but like a natural extension of the child's joy. She knelt to his level, her eyes always attentive, her responses always gentle. The first lesson came during breakfast. Hajun was playing with his food, pushing pieces of egg around. Jinwoo, on impulse, cleared his throat, ready to reprimand him. But then he remembered Minji's words. Start small, with your gaze, with listening. He restrained himself. Minji, noticing Jinwoo's hesitation, intervened softly. Hajuna, what are you building with your egg today? A mountain? She smiled, and Hajun, surprised by the question, looked at her and then at his father. Jinwoo forced a smile, an unfamiliar movement for his facial muscles. Yes, he said, his voice still a little stiff. A mountain of eggs. Hajun laughed, a sound that made Jinwoo's heart clench. He hadn't made him laugh like that in months. Minji had built a bridge, and he had stumbled across it. It was a beginning. In the days that followed, Jinwoo tried. He sat at the table with Hajun during meals, instead of eating alone in his office. He tried to ask questions, though often the words seemed stuck in his throat. He tried to read a book to Hajun before bed, but his voice, accustomed to corporate speeches, sounded monotonous for children's stories. Hajun, in turn, seemed confused by his father's new presence. He still sought Minji for most of his interactions, but occasionally he cast a curious glance at Jinwoo. Minji, with infinite patience, was always there, a discreet but firm presence. She didn't give Jinwoo orders, but offered gentle suggestions. President Lee, perhaps you could try using different voices for the characters, or Hajun loves it when you make funny faces. Jinwoo, the CEO who never accepted criticism, listened, and he tried. He found himself observing her again in the garden, but this time not with jealousy, but with an ardent desire to learn. She was teaching Hajun to identify different types of leaves. Her fingers were soft, her voice a melodic whisper. Hajun was completely absorbed. Jinwoo realized that Minji wasn't just caring for Hajun, she was living with him, sharing his world, his curiosity. One afternoon, while Hajun was taking his nap, Jinwoo found her in the kitchen, preparing a snack. He approached, the formality still present, but with a new layer of respect. "Minji-shi," he began, and she turned, surprised. I'm trying, but it's harder than I imagined." She smiled, a small, encouraging smile. "I know, President Lee, it takes time and patience, with yourself and with Hajun. You spent a long time protecting yourself from pain. Now, you need to learn to open yourself to joy." Her words struck him again. To open himself to joy. He had forgotten what that was like. His life was a fortress of work and grief. Minji wasn't just teaching him to be a father, she was unknowingly teaching him to live again. I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice almost choked. It was the first time he had expressed sincere gratitude to her. Minji shook her head. "There's no need, President Lee. Seeing Hajun happy is my greatest reward, and seeing you try, that is too." At that moment, something changed. The barrier between them, built by hierarchy and pain, cracked further. Jinwoo no longer saw her merely as the cleaner, nor as a threat. He saw her as an ally, a guide, and perhaps the only person who truly understood him. The tension was no longer one of conflict, but of a new and frightening intimacy that was beginning to form between them. He still didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a small flame of hope. And that hope, he realized, had Minji's gentle eyes and his son's laughter. The path ahead was uncertain, but he was no longer alone. The breeze of hope, which Minji had ignited, began to blow stronger, but it carried with it a different kind of chill. Not the cold of Jinwoo's loneliness, but the shiver of an intimacy he didn't know how to manage. Each day, the barrier between them lessened, and Jinwoo found himself in unfamiliar territory where the rules of the boardroom didn't apply. He, the CEO who dictated the market's pace, now found himself stumbling through childish conversations and trying to decipher his son's small gestures of affection. Progress was slow but visible. One afternoon, while trying to read a storybook to Hajun, Jinwoo found himself making a funny voice for one of the characters. It was an impulse, an unconscious imitation of how Minji read. Hajun stopped playing with his blanket and looked at him, eyes wide, before letting out a genuine laugh. The sound was like music to Jinwoo's ears, a balm for his wounded soul. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Minji, who was tidying toys in the corner, looked up and smiled at him, a smile that held all the recognition and joy he needed. In that moment, the outside world, the pressures of the company, the pain of the past, everything disappeared. There was only him, his son laughing, and Minji, the silent witness to his redemption. That small laugh was a turning point. Jinwoo began to try harder, to allow himself to be sillier, more present. He found himself observing Minji not just to learn, but to understand. He noticed the way the sunlight fell on her hair as she read to Hajun in the garden, the gentle curve of her smile when the boy hugged her. He perceived the dedication in her eyes, the patience in her hands. She wasn't just an employee. She was the personification of the joy he had lost. The tension between them, once one of conflict, was now of a different nature. It was the tension of two people walking a tightrope, each step careful, each glance laden with unspoken meanings. One night, after Hajun finally fell asleep, Jinwoo found her in the kitchen, preparing tea. The silence was deep, filled only by the soft bubbling of water. "Minji-shi," he began, his voice softer than usual, almost a whisper. I don't know what I'd do without you." She turned, her eyes slightly wide with surprise. "President Lee, you are doing a wonderful job. Hajun is much happier." "It's not just Hajun," he confessed, looking at the teacup in his hands, unable to face her directly. "Me too. I'm starting to feel again." He paused, the words difficult to utter. I was so closed off, so empty. You showed me there's still light. Minji didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, filled with an electric current of unexpressed emotions. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, almost hesitant. You always had the light within you, President Lee. You just needed someone to help ignite it again. Their eyes met. In that moment, hierarchy, status difference, everything dissolved. There were just two human beings, one vulnerable, the other a beacon of compassion. Jinwoo felt an impulse, a desire to reach out, to bridge the distance between them. But he held back. The fear of the unknown, of what this new connection could mean, was overwhelming. The next day, the reality of Jinwoo's world asserted itself. An emergency meeting in Tokyo was called. He would have to leave in a few hours. The news struck him as a brutal reminder of his old life, the life he was trying to leave behind. The anxiety of being away from Ha-jun and, he realized with a shock, from Minji, was palpable. He felt divided, pulled between duty and this new, fragile hope. When he told Minji about the trip, she nodded, her expression inscrutable. I will take care of Ha-jun, President Lee. Don't worry. But he worried. He worried about retreating into his old shell, about losing the progress he had made. He worried about leaving Ha-jun and about leaving Minji. As he prepared to leave, he saw Minji kneeling, talking to Ha-jun, assuring the boy that his father would return soon. Her image, so strong and comforting, imprinted itself on his mind. At the airport, while waiting to board, Jinwoo took out his phone. Instead of checking work emails, he opened the photo gallery. The selfie of Ha-jun and Minji was still there, his son's radiant smile, the kiss on her cheek. He looked at the photo and then at his reflection in the dark screen. He was still CEO Lee Jinwoo, but something fundamental had changed. He wasn't just going back for a meeting. He was going back home, to a son who awaited him and to a woman who, unknowingly, had become the anchor of his new life. The tension was no longer about what he would do with her, but about what he would do with himself to be worthy of the light she had brought. The Tokyo boardroom was a blur of charts and monotonous voices. Jinwoo was physically there, but his mind was thousands of miles away, floating between Ha-jun's laughter and Minji's gentle smile. Executives spoke of mergers and acquisitions, but he could only think of how Ha-jun had learned to say "appa" with a little more clarity, a progress he attributed entirely to Minji's patience. He nodded, made automatic notes, but every fiber of his being yearned to return. The anxiety of being away, once a minor annoyance, was now a sharp pain in his chest. He missed the gentle chaos of the house, Minji's comforting presence, the mere possibility of hearing his son's laughter. The meeting dragged on for endless hours. When there was finally a break, Jinwoo reached for his phone to check messages, but a chill ran down his spine. The device he held was his secondary work phone, his personal phone, the one with Ha-jun's photos, the one he had forgotten to charge the night before and left on his bedside table, was in Seoul. And on it there was a crucial document, a last-minute addendum he needed to review before the next round of negotiations, which would begin in a few hours. A foolish mistake, a lapse in concentration CEO Lee Jinwoo would never allow. The decision was instantaneous, unthinkable for a man of his position. I need to return to Seoul immediately, he announced, catching everyone by surprise. A vital document was forgotten. I will return before dawn for the final meeting. There was no time for discussion. His assistant scrambled to arrange a private jet. The urgency was real, but deep down, Jinwoo knew the need to be home was even greater. The flight back was a race against time and against his own mind. With each passing minute, the image of Ha-jun and Minji became more vivid. He wondered what they would be doing, if Ha-jun would miss him, if Minji would be all right. The tension was no longer just about the forgotten document. It was about the new vulnerability he felt, the invisible cord pulling him home. He arrived at the mansion in the middle of the night, when stars still dotted the dark sky. The house was silent, immersed in a peace he rarely felt. He entered, his steps light, trying not to make a sound. The driver was waiting to take him back to the airport as soon as he retrieved his phone. He needed to be quick. He headed to his room, but something made him stop. A soft light escaped from Hajun's slightly ajar bedroom door. Curious, and with a tightening in his heart, he approached, peeking in. What he saw paralyzed him. Minji was sitting on the floor, leaning against Hajun's bed, with the boy in her lap. The child, who should have been deeply asleep, was awake, his eyes shining with joy. Minji held Jinwoo's phone, the phone he had forgotten, and, with a soft smile, was taking a selfie. At the exact moment Jinwoo watched, Hajun leaned in and gave Minji a loud kiss on the cheek, a kiss full of affection and spontaneity. Minji's smile widened, and she laughed softly, a melodic sound that filled the room. Hajun, in turn, giggled, his eyes squeezed shut with pure happiness, his small arms clutching her neck. Jinwoo's heart leaped. And it wasn't from anger or jealousy, but from a much more complex and overwhelming emotion. It was his son's pure joy, a joy he hadn't seen in Hajun for months, perhaps years. A joy he himself couldn't evoke. The image was so intimate, so full of life and affection, that Jinwoo felt a lump in his throat. That kiss, that laughter, were irrefutable proof of the bond Minji had built with his son, a bond of love and trust that he, the father, was still desperately trying to forge. He felt like an intruder, a spectator of a sacred moment. The corporate coldness that defined him crumbled, replaced by a wave of vulnerability. He couldn't look away. The cleaner, the woman he had hired to clean his house, was there, holding his son with his phone, capturing a moment of pure happiness he had missed. And most shockingly, he felt no anger. He felt gratitude and a pang of envy, yes, but an envy that stemmed from the desire to be part of that scene. Minji didn't see him. She was absorbed in Hajun's joy, in the light radiating from him. Jinwoo retreated slowly, his heart pounding. He didn't take the phone. He couldn't interrupt that moment. The document, the meeting, everything seemed insignificant compared to that image. He returned to the car, his mind in a whirlwind. The driver was waiting. "Did you get the phone, President Lee?" the driver asked, noticing Jinwoo's stunned expression. Jinwoo shook his head, a faint smile on his lips. "No, I didn't need to." He didn't need the phone. He needed to see, and what he saw changed everything. The tension now wasn't about what he would do with Minji, but about what he would do with the truth she had revealed. The truth that his son's happiness, and perhaps his own, was intrinsically linked to that woman he had underestimated for so long. He still had the meeting in Tokyo, but now his priority had shifted. He had a new mission: to learn to love as Minji loved, to connect as she connected, to be the father his son deserved, and perhaps the person Minji deserved. The path ahead was daunting, but for the first time, he wasn't just trying to survive, he was trying to live with all the intensity life could offer. The driver waited, the car silent beneath the starry sky. Jinwoo got in, but he wasn't the same man who had exited the vehicle minutes earlier. The image of Hajun kissing Minji, his son's sincere laughter, her radiant smile, that had etched itself onto his soul. He shook his head, a faint smile on his lips, when the driver asked about the phone. "No, I didn't need to." His voice was a whisper, but it carried the weight of an epiphany. As the car glided through the night, Jinwoo felt the weight of the corporate world dissolve, replaced by an overwhelming clarity. The crucial document, the meeting in Tokyo, everything seemed an insignificant distraction compared to the truth he had witnessed. He had flown thousands of miles, driven by the urgency of a paper, but the true urgency was that of his own soul. He needed to see, and what he saw was not a mistake, but a revelation. The coldness that defined him, the armor he had built over the years, began to crack. He had always believed that control, logic, and ambition were the only valid currencies in life. But Minji, with her simplicity and warmth, had dismantled that belief. She had done what no executive, no business strategy, no therapist had managed. She had reached Hajun, and by extension himself. In the private jet, as he crossed the night sky back to Tokyo, Jinwoo couldn't focus on the reports. His mind was in Seoul, on Hajun's laughter, on Minji's kindness. He felt a strange mixture of gratitude and a pang of remorse. Remorse for having been so blind, so distant, so incapable of seeing the light that was right under his nose. He had underestimated Minji, considering her merely an employee, a cog in his domestic machine, never recognizing the humanity and love she radiated. The meeting in Tokyo was a blur. Jinwoo improvised, delegated, and somehow managed to navigate the negotiations without the document. His mind was sharp, but not for profits and losses. It was sharp for the understanding that there was something far more valuable at stake. He found himself looking at the serious faces of the executives, and the only thing he could think of was the expression of pure joy on his son's face. The tension was no longer about closing a deal, but about opening his heart. He ended the meeting as quickly as possible, refusing dinners and celebrations. "I need to return to Seoul," he declared, his voice firm but with a new urgency. "There are more important matters that require my attention." The executives were surprised but dared not question CEO Lee Jin-woo. The flight back was filled with feverish anticipation. He wasn't just returning home, he was returning to a new reality, to an opportunity for redemption. With each mile, he felt the transformation deepen. The cold CEO was dying, and a new man, vulnerable and hopeful, was being born. When he arrived at the mansion, the sun was already beginning to tint the sky with rosy hues. He entered, his heart pounding. The house was waking up. He heard soft voices coming from the kitchen. Minji was there preparing breakfast, and Ha-jun was sitting in his high chair, babbling happily. Jinwoo approached, hesitant. Minji turned, her eyes wide with surprise at seeing him back so early. "President Lee, you're back!" Her voice was a mix of relief and confusion. He didn't respond immediately. He just watched her, the morning light framing her profile, her simple apron, her hair tied back. She was the personification of the calm and warmth he had sought in vain in his sterile life. Ha-jun, seeing his father, extended his small arms, a wide smile on his face. "Appa!" Jinwoo knelt, embracing his son with an intensity he had never shown before. He smelled Ha-jun, felt the warmth of his small body, and a wave of love flooded him. He looked at Minji, his eyes meeting hers. There was no longer the barrier of hierarchy, only deep gratitude and an overwhelming desire to connect. "Minji-shi," he began, his voice hoarse with emotion. I saw." She looked at him confused. "Saw what, President Lee?" He smiled, a genuine smile that rarely appeared on his face. "I saw you and Ha-jun last night, the selfie." He paused, the words difficult to form. I've never seen Ha-jun so happy, not like that." Minji blushed slightly, averting her gaze. "I'm so sorry, President Lee. I shouldn't have used your phone. I just wanted—" "No," he interrupted her, standing up and taking a step towards her. "Don't apologize. Never. What I saw was the most beautiful thing I've seen in a long time." He extended his hand, hesitantly, and gently touched her shoulder. "You brought light to this house, Minji. You brought light to Ha-jun, and you showed me that I can still feel." The silence stretched, filled by Ha-jun's soft breathing and Jinwoo's accelerated heartbeat. Minji looked at him, her eyes welling up, surprise transforming into a deeper emotion. "I was so lost," he continued, his voice almost a whisper. "I was so focused on everything but what truly mattered. You taught me a lesson that years of advice and money never could." He removed his hand from her shoulder, but his eyes didn't waver. "I no longer want to be the cold CEO, Minji. I want to be the father Hajun deserves, and I want to learn from you." The tension was no longer about what he would do with her, but about what they would do together. The story of the cold CEO and the cleaner wasn't about a scandal, but about redemption. Jinwoo wasn't just offering gratitude, he was offering a part of himself, an invitation to build something new, something real. Minji finally smiled, a smile that lit up the entire room. "You are already a good father, President Lee," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You just needed to remember how to love." He nodded, his eyes fixed on hers. The path ahead was uncertain, full of challenges and vulnerabilities. But for the first time in a long time, Jinwoo felt no fear. He felt hope. The hope that with Minji by his side, he could finally find the way to true happiness, to a true family. The light she had ignited wasn't just for Hajun, but for all of them, illuminating the future that was about to begin.